Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Cabinet Ministers have been making a series of speeches under the title The Road to Brexit. This morning, we've been hearing from Environment Secretary Michael Gove on farming, and Trade Secretary Liam Fox is talking about trade, unsurprisingly. But first up today was the Brexit Secretary David Davis, who told an audience in Vienna that after the UK leaves the EU, it won't plunge into a Mad Max-style world borrowed from dystopian fiction, and that the UK would always maintain high standards to ensure frictionless trade with the EU. So what's all the fuss about? Well, David Davis said that fears of a race to the bottom on issues like workers' rights and environmental protection were based on nothing. Labour and leaders of some of the largest trade unions have long claimed the Conservatives are pursuing a bargain basement Brexit that would turn the UK into a low-wage, offshore tax haven with assaults on workers' rights and environmental protection. That was partly prompted by the Prime Minister's oft-repeated assertion that no deal is better than a bad deal, by Philip Hammond saying a year ago that the UK would do whatever we have to do to remain competitive, even if forced to change our economic model. And the fact that during the referendum, the Vote Leave campaign, led by Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, now senior members of the Cabinet, had claimed EU regulations cost UK small business over £600 million a week. But the government has pointed out that its flagship EU withdrawal bill enshrines all EU protections into UK law, so there'll be continuity immediately after Brexit. And just last month, Philip Hammond said there was no appetite for a major change to the UK's economic model, whatever people say, and that people in the UK remain attracted to a European-style social economy with strong protections for labour, the environment and welfare recipients. Well, earlier, David Davis took aim at those who claim Brexit will be used as an excuse to slash regulations.
These fears about a race to the bottom are based on nothing. Not our history, not our intentions, not our national interest. Frankly, the competitive challenge we in the UK and the European Union will face from the rest of the world, where 90% of growth in markets will come from, will not be met by a reduction in standards.
David Davis. Well, for more, we can talk to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, who is in Vienna, where David Davis has been giving that speech. Vicky Young, what did we learn from the Brexit Secretary?
I think it's just been very striking, not just today's speech, but Theresa May at the Munich Security Conference a few days ago. It's all about cooperation continuing into the future. And you think about the argument that has been made by some in the Conservative Party for decades. The whole point of leaving the European Union is because of red tape, bureaucracy, stifling British business. We can be set free from all of that. That really wasn't the tone today. The tone from David Davis was much more about reassurance, saying to people that we're not going to undercut those high standards. In fact, higher standards is what we want, and that's what we're going to try to achieve. And speaking to some Austrian business people afterwards, they certainly felt that the tone from British ministers has changed in the last year. They think it's all about the reality starting to bite, that in the end, when it comes certainly to manufacturing goods, that the UK realises to keep that frictionless trade that we want so much, we are going to have to keep some kind of alignment. How we do that, though, of course, has not been sorted out, and that Cabinet Ministers meeting at the country residence checkers in the next couple of days. We've heard that Theresa May have to lock them in the room overnight for them to get a deal.
Oh, sounds great. I mean, Vicky, if there has been a change in tone when it comes to this idea of regulatory alignment and not being set free in terms of regulation, aren't there going to be those who voted leave and some key members of the Cabinet be very disappointed?
Yeah, and I think this is the key thing. Can that pragmatic approach, if you like, which some think David Davis has always had, will that persuade some of the others? Boris Johnson, for example. Now, he made that first speech on this road to Brexit scenario going around Europe with various ministers laying out their plans. He did talk, though, acknowledge that in some cases there may have to be some kind of alignment. But I still don't think we know how they're going to do that. And, of course, maybe more crucially, what the European Union will say about it. But today from David Davis has all about, look, you can trust us. We've been your partner for very many years. You know you can trust us on all of this. You know, we can make this work. Whether that trust is there or not, of course, is a different matter.
Vicky Young, thank you. Well, to discuss this, we're joined by the Conservative MP and long-time Brexit supporter, Duncan Smith, and Labour's Chuka Umunna, who supports the campaign group Open Britain, which wants the UK to remain in the single market and the customs union. Welcome to both of you. Duncan Smith, do you detect a change in tone? All this talk about Britain being set free from burdensome regulation, all out the window.
Not really, no. I think that what he's saying is what the government's been saying for a long time, which is, first of all, as we leave, we are binding in everything into UK law. That was part of the bill that went through.
In perpetuity?
No, nothing is in perpetuity, because obviously, like anything else that exists in domestic legislation, you review it and decide what's the key is. And there are lots of areas where we will no doubt want to review and check. I mean, when it comes to things like workers' rights, we have already the most flexible workforce in Europe. There is literally no reason why we would suddenly have to try and dump regulations on that, because it's more flexible than Germany. So that isn't an issue. The reality is, though, there are other areas that you look at, and we will try and change some of those regulations. When we were in government with the Liberal Democrats, we used to have a very simple rule that for every regulation you wanted to bring in, you had to find 3 regulations you would get rid of.
Sure, so which ones?
So controlling this. Well, let me just give you a list of them. I wrote them out before I came. I'll give you a whole list of these things.
Just a few to start.
OK, the Clinical Trials Directive, which has dumped non-commercial trials in the UK. It's been appalling. We were the leaders in commercial trials. Wait a minute, let's go on. The MiFID II, which is coming in, is going to destroy a lot of ordinary small stockbrokers with a massive amount of new extra regulation. The other one, which is really quite interesting, Solvency II. Now, Solvency II damages the UK because the UK has this equity market where people get equity release as they get older. What's actually happened now is that puts nearly 1 to 2% extra cost on that. We'll want to look at that.
All right.
Labelling, for example. Some of the labelling is so vast,
all right.
It's bigger than the packages that they now
You've given us some examples.
There are more than that. I'm simply saying that there are lots of areas we will look at. What he wasn't saying today is we won't look to change. What he was saying was we will always look to discuss that with our European partners in a free trade arrangement and explain to them why we want to change stuff where it's necessary, that's all.
What is your evidence, Chuka Umunna? We've had some examples from Duncan Smith, but any evidence that the government is planning anything like a bonfire of the regulations after Brexit?
Well, you just have to look at the comments of leading members of the Cabinet, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Liam Fox. They've all talked about further liberalising the labour market. And part of the problem that David Davis and many people on Ian's side of the argument have is their record. Ian's maiden speech in May 1992 celebrated the fact that we were coming out of the European Social Chapter. He then gave a speech in the same Parliament in 1996. In July... I do.
Never mind, don't get distracted.
On my spirit, you did, but in July 1996, Ian was celebrating, the need for a more laissez-faire approach to employment regulations. And the problem is, when you look at these guys, this man voted for unfair dismissal to be more difficult to claim. This guy voted for compensation for unfair dismissal to be reduced. This guy voted for employment tribunal fees, which were ruled to be unlawful by the Supreme Court, to be introduced. And now they want you to give them the benefit of the doubt and have you believe that they want...
Well, okay, so would you go ahead with those things?
No, listen.
Right, so you don't stand by what you said?
Coalition, no, I do stand by what I said.
So you do want to strip away working regulations?
No, stop a second. Don't make this so simplistic that people don't get it. The point is not that. The point is that the problem when you make regulations for the whole of the European Union, areas in the European Union that have very different traditions and also different marketplaces. I gave you 2 examples in the financial services sector. Hang on a second, where they damage us. Now, the difference in leaving now is the UK will look to make the regulations that either protect workers or whatever that are relevant to UK working patterns, not that are relevant to Greek or Italian patterns. And that is a big difference. And by the way, we have a very high level of worker protection in the UK.
Thanks to the last Labour government.
Also, hugely thanks to the Conservative and the coalition government. I can name lots of things that the Labour government did that I didn't agree with and I thought were terrible.
Duncan Smith, hang on, let me put that, because what specific...
we do it for the UK, that's what means when we leave.
What specific rights did the Conservatives go into the 2017 election promising to scrap?
Well, they didn't go in promising to scrap specific rights in 2010, but they did so. And this is the problem. in many respects, you say, well, what is the evidence? We know what they wanted to do.
Evidence?
Well, the Beecroft review. There is. The Beecroft.
Wait a minute, Duncan Smith. Let him respond. Let him respond.
The Beecroft review, which was done during the 2010 to 2015 Parliament, made a whole series of recommendations. And number 10, and it was commissioned by David Cameron. Duncan Smith was part of that cabinet, made a load of recommendations, and it was dumped partly. Well, first of all, half of it was actually implemented, and the other half wasn't implemented because EU employment law protected British workers and stopped them stripping
let me get the record straight on this. The Beecroft review came in, and all of us argued that we did not have the need for implementing any of that stuff because we have...
Why was it commissioned then in the first place? Because he actually did put forward and propose quite radical regulations.
It was commissioned by Steve Hilton because he wanted a businessman to come and look at whether or not it's feasible to make our labour force more flexible. The argument I made at the time, and I continue to make, the UK now, and I was in Germany not so long ago talking to them, and they say, we admire it because you have a more flexible set of regulations than we do.
That means less protection.
Hang on a second. The reality, therefore, is we already have a much greater, more flexible workforce. And here's what happens when you have a really flexible workforce. You end up with low unemployment, more people back in work than anywhere else in Europe.
But let's talk about what you've actually said, because you said we should use Brexit to slash red tape and regulation. We could whittle away unnecessary rules and lessen the burden on business and citizens. But we've just heard from Chuka Umunna that those do include workers' protections and workers' rights in a broad sense.
Let me tell you, I've just given you a list of things. I could give you more than this, by the way.
OK, can I ask you one question?
I've given you, hang on a second.
Name one area of employment law where you want to strengthen...
Let him answer my question first.
Here's the point. I have already given you a set of examples, which I don't think anybody wanted, but I've given them to you. The reality is they are none of them about workers' rights. They are all about a marketplace being damaged by over-regulation. There is lots of that that's been going on, and the problem with Chuka and his side of the argument is they always want to take this straight into, oh, they're going to damage you, they're going to harm you, they're going to hurt you.
You've done that already.
No elected government, no elected British government would deliberately come in trying to damage people's lives.
Let me put this question then to Chuka Umunna.
And let them generate income that provides work and jobs for people. That may mean do
the important point there,
many of my constituents who've suffered from your benefit changes.
But who won the election? Who won the election in 2015? If people were so exercised about their rights being stripped away, why didn't they elect a Labour government protecting those rights? The point is, if a British government changes the rules and regulations in the future, post-Brexit, the British people can decide to kick them out.
That's true, and of course you admitted one thing. Labour may not have won, but Theresa May lost her majority, and that is a very important thing.
I was talking about 2015.
But there's a very important question.
You said rights had been stripped away in 2010, so if people were unhappy about it, they would... But anyway, the broad point is the British people could decide, couldn't they, to chuck out a government?
There's one question, though. There's a very important question here. You either diverge because you want to reduce protections, whether it's on employment, the environment or the consumer, or you diverge to increase protections. Please name an area of employment law, for example, where you want to increase protection and diverge for that purpose.
I don't have a list of things that I want to have for employment law, but I do know this. I have absolutely no plans, and the government has no plans, to lessen workers' rights. But here's one thing that we did. Hang on. Whilst you were in government, it was my government, and it was my idea, that actually has pushed the minimum wage up to £9 an hour. Labour never did that. No, Labour never got above £6 an hour. And the reality is it's that which will do more to protect workers in work. There's plenty of stuff that we've done. I'm sorry, this lovely chest-beating idea the Labour Party has, only they protect people who go to work. I tell you, the least protected person is the person out of work. And you had terrible levels of unemployment when you left government.
All right, well, let Chuka Umunna...
We have high ones.
Well, let Chuka Umunna answer that.
Well, I'm not going to take you back in history again to 3 million unemployed under Margaret Thatcher. But of course, you look in Hansard again and you will see Ian arguing against the introduction of the national minimum wage in the first place. And I'm pleased there's been this about turn. I'm pleased there's been this about turn. But don't let anyone believe that somehow you were a champion of the national minimum wage. You didn't want it introduced in the first place.
I wanted it raised.
Right, but hang on, Boris Johnson...
I did. I argued
did you agree,
Ian, eventually when George Osborne raised it, I was the one cheering.
Don't talk over each other. Ian Duncan Smith, Boris Johnson said on the 6th of June 2014, the weight of employment regulation is now back-breaking. The Collective Redundancies Directive, the Atypical Workers Directive, the Working Time Directive, and 1,000 more. Do you agree with him that these are the things that have been back-breaking for the British workforce?
I think it's important to look at all regulations that came in via the European Union, decide whether or not they work well in the UK. But I gave you a list.
I know you've given that example.
No, but just my point I want to make is there is a whole list of things which we don't think fits the UK's way of working. And when we have a free trade arrangement, what we want to be able to do is to preserve those good bits and make sure the other bits either are changed and modified or get rid of it.
Ian Duncan Smith, what is the point of leaving the EU if Britain doesn't massively deregulate? I mean, what will the country have to offer post-Brexit unless it is a low-tax, low-regulation economy?
Well, the truth is what we will not have is the massive level of cost of money that we have to send to the European Union. We will not also have to impose many of those damaging regulations I talked about that destroy British
But that's not the answer to my question.
Hang on a second. I've just told you deregulation isn't always just about people's workers' rights. It's also about rules and regulations on reporting in business that cost massive amounts of money, that make business less effective and less competitive. Changing those will help improve things.
What do you think, having listened to that debate?
I was very struck by Chuka's remark that you can diverge by increasing regulation as well as by decreasing regulation. And I suppose my sense is that post-Brexit, what will happen is that over time there will be increasing divergence. Yes. And probably some of it, half the country will welcome, the other half will scream about, and vice versa. But I do think that what we do have to accept, and that's clearly what the government is accepting, is that we live in an incredibly and increasingly regulated globe. And it does impose real costs, but it's the reality, and you cannot trade unless your goods and your services are recognised as acceptable by the country you're exporting to. So the reality is we are going to regulate and regulate and regulate well beyond my death, and that will be true whether or not we crash out or get a good deal.
Thank you both very much. You'll have to crash out of the studio just for now. The Deputy Leader... Yes, it wasn't that bad.
I've been getting away with it all my